The Civil Rights Movement was a very important time for blacks and must not be forgotten. During this time, black people were getting taken for granted and were not able to reach their full potential. White people were so arrogant in their old ways that they overlooked the fact that black were humans too. This is why this era is so important. This is my oral history project. For blacks living in the South during the 1960s was a very hard time. There were many movements happening as black people were trying to acquire equal rights. Martin Luther King Jr. was one of the primary leaders in this movement. He traveled over 6 million times and spoke over 2,500 times, most of which he was preaching nonviolence among the blacks. As we learned in class, there were various racial codes that a black man was supposed to follow, such as using the segregated facilities or letting a white man order first. Black people were treated completely different in the South than in the North. If you misbehaved in the South, there were severe consequences, like the KKK, which would often burn, bomb, and kill blacks who they thought were not following the social code of conduct. In the South, even the legal system was corrupt. The courts would often favor the whites in any case against the blacks. However, in the South, there were various movements to stop this inequality. Even after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed, which outlawed the discrimination based on race, the blacks were still not treated equal because of this severe racism embedded in the culture of the South. Here's an example of one of the racial codes that they had to follow in the South that my grandfather told me.
And the other thing I noticed was as we walked through town, the blacks were very deferential. This was in the South, of course. I don't think that would have been so much true in the Northeast or the northern part of the country, but they would look down. They wouldn't look you straight in the eye as you walk down the sidewalk. They would get off the sidewalk to let you pass and step out into the gutter area.
Chicago was one of the large cities involved in the Civil Rights Movement. There were lots of oppression, and Martin Luther King spoke there several times. There were various movements happening in Chicago during the Civil Rights Movement. The biggest civil rights campaign was the Chicago Freedom Movement, which lasted from mid-1965 to early 1967. This movement represented the Alliance of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC, and the Coordinating Council of Community Organizations, or the CCCO. They were determined to end slums in the city. This is just one of the many things occurring in Chicago during the time. There were also the Black Panthers actively involved in Chicago, but my grandfather did not have any first-hand knowledge to share with the Black Panthers. However, my grandfather did tell me that there were certain parts of Chicago that you definitely did not want to travel through. He said that the southern part of Chicago that was primarily black and they did not like white men. The blacks were often hostile towards the whites as they were fighting for equality. While in Chicago, he could feel the racial tensions. Here's an example of this.
To me, it was a personal experience because we rode the Illinois Central commuter train from a suburb that we lived in south of Chicago through the black section of Chicago into downtown Chicago in the Loop where I worked. And the day following Martin Luther King's assassination, the blacks had shot at the commuter train, and there had been a few sniper shots. And so when we went through that section, it was sort of interesting that they didn't shut the train down. They kept the train running, but we were told to pull our blinds on the window and get below the level of the window and crouch down in our seats in case any more snipers shot at the train.
Here are some words from my man Malcolm X.
And it's another miracle that the black man hasn't taken up arms and show that he is just as willing to fight his enemy in this country as he has been willing to fight the enemy of this country on the battlefields of Korea and Germany and in the South Pacific and other places.
You think the time will come when Negroes will take up arms?
The time will come when any people and all people on this earth will develop enough intelligence to know that they are within their rights to do whatever is necessary to protect themselves. We're born at a time, and we live in an era when no oppressed people will be satisfied to let the oppressor continue to oppress them without doing something about it. And as the oppressed awaken and become very eager to defend themselves, the oppressor himself is going to step up his activity. And step up activity on the part of both will produce an explosion that's just as certain as the rising of the sun on the eastern horizon in the morning.
As Malcolm X mentions, it is only a measure of time until the black people fight back against the whites. Obviously, there were strong racial tensions between the blacks and the whites. There were various racial movements, like the Freedom Summer and the sit-ins, going on during this time. In the late 1960s, there was the rise of black nationalism. This was led by Malcolm X and was widespread across the country, which increased black violence. He was a firm believer of separation of blacks from whites. He believed that blacks were equal, if not better than whites. This belief helped to lead to a strong tension that was built up between the blacks and the whites. In the 1960s, my grandfather could feel the tension, as Malcolm X said, about the oppressed doing something against the oppressor.
At one time, right after we moved there, I was driving on a weekend, and we went downtown, and I think I was showing some people around downtown, and we were coming back on the Dan Ryan Expressway, which is the expressway that cuts right through the black part of Chicago. And I decided to pull off in there and get some gasoline. I pulled into a gas station, and everybody was black.
Even the workers?
Even the workers, everybody in their cars. There wasn't a white person to be seen, and they wouldn't fuel up my car.
Surprisingly, there were strong racial codes in the western part of the country. Oregon was a very racially segregated state during the Civil Rights Movement. In 1859, Oregon entered the Union as a free state, but its first constitution banned black people from visiting or moving into this state. Oregon was the last West Coast state to pass the Public Accommodations Law, which made it illegal for hotels, restaurants, and amusement parks to discriminate on the basis of race. In 1954, the Brown v. Board of Education case outlawed segregation in schools. In 1962, the NAACP charged Portland with having racially segregated schools. This just shows how racism was present and deep in Oregon's society. Portland.gov states that, though no current concrete evidence that sundown laws existed on the statute books has been found in Oregon, there is a rich oral history. It describes signs and attitudes throughout Oregon well into the 1970s that warned blacks and other people of color to be out of town by sundown. Due to these laws, my grandfather did not grow up with any black people. He said that the first time he went to school with a black person was in college.
Even while I was a young person, pre-teenager, there was a law that blacks could not sleep overnight in Forest Grove, Oregon, where I grew up.